Hi, Dick. Thanks so much for being on the show.
It's great to be here, Keith.
Yeah, great. So we do tend to like to start with more of a personal question of, how you got to where you are today. It's kind of specifically like, how did you discover parts work? And, just maybe 5 minutes of just like, where does discovery come from? And I know your background's somewhat in family systems and very curious about that.
Yeah, so I stumbled into it. I was, go all the way back. In college, I was an aide on a psychiatric unit in the hospital my father was head of medicine in. And it was an adolescent unit, so these kids weren't that much younger than me. And I would get close to them and hear about the kind of therapy they were getting, which was pretty psychoanalytic at the time. And then during weekends, I was, on the floor when their families would visit. And I would see their families tearing into them. How could you do this to us? And so on. But none of that was being talked about in their therapy. And I thought there's something wrong with this picture. And so that's what drove me to family therapy. And I became a kind of zealot of thinking we had found the Holy Grail and that all these people who spent their time in the inner world of psychodynamic world were wasting their time because we could change all that just by reorganizing these relationships. And to prove that, once I got a real job, I decided to do an outcome study. And with a colleague named Mary Jo Barrett, collected about 30 bulimic kids and their families in the early 1980s and did a straight, what we called structural strategic approach that in many cases we were successful with. And so I was expecting these kids to immediately stop binging. And to my chagrin, many of them didn't realize that they'd been cured. And they kept binging and purging. And then out of frustration, I began asking why. And they started talking about these parts of them. And they would say some version of, there's this critic that attacks me whenever anything goes wrong in my life. And then that brings up a part that feels totally bereft and empty and alone and young and worthless. And that feeling is so distressing that almost to the rescue comes the binge and takes me out. But the act of the binge brings back the critic, who's now calling me a pig on top of the other names. And that brings back that empty, young, desperate, worthless part. So it sounded to me similar to the family sequences I'd been studying and intervening into. And so I got curious. But at first I was making the same mistake that most therapies make and that most all our culture makes, which is to assume these parts were what they seem to be. And when you make that assumption, then you're going to try and get your client to fight with the critic and stand up for themselves or to control the binge and that approach just makes them stronger. And my clients were getting worse, but I didn't know what else to do until I found a client that I knew had an extensive sex abuse history and cut herself on her wrist and decided that I couldn't allow that to happen on my watch. So, and by then I'd learned the Gestalt empty chair technique, which means you could have a client sit in one chair and talk to an empty chair across from them, imagining they were talking to that part, and then shift and be the part talking back. And because I was hearing 5 and 6 parts, I would have lots of chairs and my clients are hopping all over. And so one session I decided we're going to really browbeat this cutting part until it agrees not to do it this week. And of course, after 2 hours of me harassing the part and her doing it, it finally said, okay, I won't cut her. And then, of course, the next session, I open the door and she's got a massive slice down her face. And I just spontaneously, emotionally collapsed and said, I can't beat you at this, and this is a dangerous game. And the part said, I don't really want to beat you. And that was the turning point in the history of this model, because I shifted out of that coercive, we've got to control you without really getting to know you, to just being curious. Okay, so why do you do this to her? And the part proceeded to tell me about how when she was being abused, it saved her life, and it would get her out of her body, and it would contain the rage that would get more abuse. And so then I shifted again. Now I'm not just curious, but I have an appreciation for the heroic role it played in her life. And I can extend that to it, and she have hers extend that to it. And it burst into tears because everyone had demonized it and tried to get rid of it. And talk more about why it still needed to do this. But as it talked about that, it became clear to me that it wasn't living in the present. It was still living back in those abuse scenes. And it thought, her father was around to do this any moment. And that it carried what I'm going to call burdens, which are extreme beliefs and emotions that came into her during those times of abuse. And in my exploring, it became clear that these things were not native to the person, that they came from the experience, these beliefs and emotions, but they attached to these parts, almost like a virus, pardon the expression these days, and then drive the activity of the parts thereafter. So as I got all that, I started to think maybe these parts are like kids in a family, because family therapy's big insight was you can't take an acting out kid out of their family and expect them to just stop doing it. You have to explore the network of relationships that kid is trapped in, that's forcing him into this role in the family, and then try to change that. Maybe the same thing is true with these parts. Maybe this isn't a cutting part. Maybe it's a part that did try to save her life and was forced into that role. Maybe the critic isn't just a nasty parental internalization. Maybe it is also trying to protect her in some way, and so on. And so, and then the other big discovery, for lack of a better word, is as I began to get clients to start to dialogue with these parts, and I'm a family therapist, so I'm trying to have people talk to each other. I'm trying to have parts talk, the person talk to the parts. And now I know they aren't what they seem, so I'm trying to have the person get curious about them rather than fight with them or shame them or anything. And I'm trying to do that. And, maybe I'm having my bulimic kid talk to her critic. And suddenly she's furious with the critic. And as a family therapist, I was taught to look around the room and see if somebody isn't covertly siding with that kid against her critical mother. I think maybe the same thing's happening in the Zen system. Maybe as she's trying to get to know this critic, some part that hates the critic has come in and is doing the talking. So I began saying, could you find the one who hates the critic and just get it to step back in there? And to my amazement, clients would say, okay, it did. I say, now how do you feel toward the critic? It would be entirely different. It was like a different person had come forward, been released, who was calm, who was curious and confident, and would say some version, I'm just kind of curious about why he calls me names all the time. Seconds earlier, they hated it or they were terrified of it. And it's like this new person just popped out. And actually, as they stayed, knew how to relate to the critic or other parts too, in ways that will allow them to tell their secret histories of how they got forced into their roles. And then from that point, we could actually start to begin to help them change. So that's, I don't know if that was 5 minutes or not, but that's the history.
Great. Thank you. That leads into our next question about the types of sort of what are the most common. It sounds like the critic is one of the parts that you see almost universally, I imagine. What are some of the other things for therapists to look for in terms of types of parts that you see time and time again with trauma?
Yeah, so the critic and the other names I used aren't this is an important point, they aren't the essence of the part. They're the role the part was forced into. And so at some point I got curious about, is there a map to this territory? Are there common roles across people, especially people with trauma? And so we do have a map now. I actually was driven to create it because I learned the hard way the mistakes of not having a map, because these are delicate ecologies, as you know, that you're entering. And so when I was interviewing people about their parts, I would hear about parts that were very vulnerable and carried burdens of terror or emotional pain or sense of being totally worthless, and seemed to be stuck in dreadful places in the past. And it made sense that that's what we needed to heal. So I would work to get there as soon as I could. And there are techniques that can do this very quickly, like EMDR and things like that. But I would find that my clients were having pretty dreadful experiences immediately after our sessions. I had a client get into a car wreck and said she just didn't see the car, or spike 104, 103 fever. And at some point I started putting two and two together and said, there's something I'm doing wrong here. And this is dangerous. You know, I come from a medical family, which is first do no harm. So I almost backed away from the whole phenomenon and just, quit. But then I got curious. I started asking, what am I doing wrong here? And I was taught by my clients that I was going to these, what I have come to call exiled parts of them, without permission from the parts that didn't want them or anybody else going to these parts. And they were being punished by those, what we call protectors, for the violation of the inner rules. And once I got that, then as a family therapist, it all made more sense. It's like going into a family and throwing open the closets and getting all the dirty laundry out right away without any, caring or connection to the parents.
Right.
So that's what we find, that we've all had experiences that where what before the trauma or before the attachment injury were playful inner children, happy, creative, delighted, loving of awe and intimacy, get hurt because they're our most sensitive parts. They get hurt the most by those traumas. And once they get hurt or terrified or feel ashamed and carry that burden, we don't want anything to do with them anymore because they have the power to pull us back into those times and make us feel as bad as we did then. And so to avoid that, we will lock them away in inner basements or abysses or caves and try our best to just move on. And everybody around us, including therapists often, tell you to just move on, don't look back, you can't change what happened. Let it go, don't be so sensitive. So as a result, we all have a bunch of these exiles. And for the exiles, it's insult to injury. The injury was the trauma, and then the insult is our abandoning of them. So they're really hurting, they're really raw, and we're really scared of them. And so then we have all these protectors who, before they became protectors, were just doing their fun, valuable roles. Sometimes they're advisors or they're sort of sentries and so on. But once you get a bunch of exiles, they're forced into becoming protectors in a big way. And some of them are going to manage your life so that nothing ever triggers the exiles. So they're big into control. They're big into not letting anybody get close enough to trigger you, not letting people you depend on get too distant. They're into controlling your appearance so that you don't get rejected, controlling your performance so you get a lot of accolades. And because of all that, and because there's so much to control, they often become these critics inside because they don't know what else to do but to yell at you to try and get you to behave so you'll stay safe. So that we call them the managers. They're trying to manage your life so that your exiles don't get triggered and so they stay contained. And some of them are these critics, some of them are caretakers, for example. They just take care of everybody else and don't let you take care of yourself. Or there's a whole wide range of common manager roles. Sometimes they're the hypervigilant ones, sometimes, those kind of things. So we've all got a bunch of managers. They got us through graduate school. They have their role. And then because they can't always protect us, because the world has a way of bypassing or getting through those defenses and triggering the exiles, there's another set of parts whose job is to handle that emergency. And they'll go into action immediately if an exile gets triggered to either douse the flames or get you higher than the flames of emotion or distract you until it burns itself out. And so we call them firefighters because they're fighting this fire of exiled emotion. And they, often are what you might expect, the parts that get into rage or that take you into addictions or, all kinds of impulsive behaviors. And they don't care about the collateral damage to your body or to your relationships because they know they've just got to deal with this or you're going to die. That's their thinking. So we all have managers and firefighters. So that's the map. It's pretty simple. There are these protectors, one class of which we call managers, the other firefighters, based on whether their role is designed to preempt the triggering of the exiles or react to it after it's happened. And they're both trying to contain and protect exiles. And then we have this self, which I forgot to mention is the name I came to call that person who kept popping up with all these great qualities. But for many people we work with initially, that self has been totally obscured by these parts who have taken over because they don't trust self anymore. Because self couldn't protect you when you were young. And they're like, in family therapy, we used to call them parentified inner children. They're having to take on the responsibility of running your life, despite the fact that they're just little kids, most of them. So, long answer to your question.
Really helpful. Thank you.
You said the word trauma a number of times, particularly we're talking about these exiled parts. And I'm curious, Dick, if you see IFS as a trauma modality.
It's become a trauma modality, yeah. It's very popular in the trauma world. But for me, that's not all it is. It's much bigger than that. But yes, it's become a very popular trauma modality.
And let's unpack the self. I've done a good amount of had a good amount of exposure to your work. I'm very curious about the concept of the self with the capital S. Mm-hmm. And so, is this a spiritual concept for you? Is it a metaphysical concept for you? Is it a personal concept? I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts about the self.
Yeah, if I heard myself saying this even 20 years ago, I would be shocked. But yeah, it has become quite a spiritual idea for me. When I first stumbled onto it in the process that I described earlier, I struggled because I'd been taught, like probably both of you, that for anybody to have those kind of resources inside, that kind of ego strength, they had to have had a certain kind of parenting at the critical stage in their development. Basic attachment theory. And absent that, they had to get it from some external relationship. You're not born with it, basically.
Right.
And here I was working with people that not only didn't have good enough parenting, but had been tortured on a daily basis. And still, when enough parts open space, it was the same damn self that would show up. And I couldn't square that with traditional psychology. So I had actually, I come from basically an atheistic scientific family. So, but I had some students that would say, this sounds kind of like Buddha nature, or this sounds kind of like Atman in Hinduism, or this kind of the soul, or Christ consciousness, and so I started to look into those other traditions and found that not only does it sound like, but they're basically describing the same thing in different words. Every, especially the contemplative sides of every religious tradition have words for this and describe it basically exactly the same. And so then I did start to think maybe this is more of a spiritual thing that can't be damaged, and it turns out it can't be damaged, is in everybody, and as you unpack it, it just starts to heal. And so that's the way I see it now.
Is this, in your framework for the visual people out there, is the self at the center of a personality structure? Is it just another part in a wheel? How do you frame that now?
Yeah, center works, essence. So it is more like maybe the sun with the planets as the parts sort of circling around, but also blending with, and that's part of the issue, that parts can obscure the self by what we call blending, so that there are times where if I get really angry at my wife, for example, there goes compassion, there goes curiosity, there goes courage, there goes all those 8 C's. And I'm left with this sort of seething, angry part of me and through that part's eyes, she looks ugly to me. Don't let her hear this. But, so that would be that angry part having blended with me so thoroughly that it obscures myself. And I used to think, oh my God, myself is gone, but it turns out it's sort of like the eclipse of the sun. Once the moon moves past it, self's still there, it's shining as brightly. So that's the idea, that it's always there and just beneath the surface of these parts. So unlike a lot of those traditions I mentioned, you don't have to meditate 20 years to get to it. All you need to do is convince these parts it's safe to open space for it.
Let me ask one more follow-up question, and I'm going to pass the mic to Will about the self. I'm assuming that the other individual parts we're speaking of are unique to the human being in terms of the way they speak, and there's a uniqueness, a unique quality to each part, to that person. Is the self actually a collective self, that it's not unique at all to any individual, or is it unique to the individual?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So first of all, when they're in their extreme roles, they're far less unique. So the critics basically say the same thing across people, and so on and so on. But once released from those roles, once unburdened, and they can be who they're designed to be, yes, there's a tremendous amount of uniqueness, which is beautiful. It's really wonderful. It's what makes us human and different. And then there is this self that is more a collective thing, because it does show up in the same way in everybody, pretty much. And for me, it's a kind of field, if you can think about it that way, where it can be particleized. It can kind of be in one of us, and we'll have boundaries and feel like we're separate. But if you meditate certain ways, or take MDMA or ketamine or something like that, you'll enter this wave state where you lose your individuality and you're in the non-dual, And for me, it's the same self. It's just a different manifestation of self. There's the particle and the wave, like a photon in quantum physics. So again, it's a long answer to your question. It's a bit of a complicated question, but yes, it's more something we all share, which is why it does show up pretty much in the same way throughout humanity, I think, which is at some level is very profound.
You know, it's interesting that you brought up ketamine and MDMA because Keith and I run a clinic in Boulder where we do a lot of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. And the kind of protocol that we run for the therapy is largely based on being mentored by Michael Mithofer and the MAPS protocol for MDMA psychotherapy.
That's great. And Michael teaches some IFS, right?
Yes. And he wrote the protocol for MAPS for the MDMA psychotherapy, and there's a large amount of IFS in there. And I, as an MDMA therapist, I found it incredibly effective to work with parts in this kind of, you were talking about this kind of transcendent wave-like place of resource. I'm curious where you see the future of, I would say maybe psychedelic psychotherapy with IFS.
Yeah, my goal is for IFS to become the map to that territory, because I don't think there really is a map at this point. And IFS has many advantages. So what I felt very, very validated when Michael started doing this work and would show me some of the videos, because as you've seen probably, without any cueing from the therapist, people just start doing IFS. They just start working with their parts.
Absolutely.
The actual self, and they just start doing it.
It's spontaneous.
Totally spontaneous. So it really reassured me that I had just stumbled onto something that everybody knows how to do if they can get certain parts out of the way. And the medications, the psilocybin and the MDMA and ketamine, access a lot of self. They help protectors relax for some reason. You do it in two different ways. The ketamine, you kind of leave your body, but coming back, you're in a lot of self. And then the MDMA, you're just in your body in a lot of self with a hugely open heart. And then your parts feel welcome, and that's why they pop up. And Michael kept track of that in his early studies and found over 70% of his clients spontaneously started doing IFS.
Wow.
So, yeah, I really want it to be the map to the territory, partly because it so much helps if you understand these are protectors that come up, and you don't panic when somebody has a panic attack or has a psychotic break or seems like, or something like that, and you, in fact, help the client stay in self and get to know whatever that is that came up. And then you prevent the backlash by working up front with protectors, and there's a lot of unburdening that you can do when you're in that state. So anyway, that's one of my big goals, and I'm not sure how to do it, but I'm glad Michael's a big supporter.
Yeah, ever since I came across your work about 20 years ago, it felt like almost like a homecoming for me, because as a younger guy in college, I was studying ritual and cultural anthropology and how altered states and indigenous cultures seem to accelerate the processing of grief and trauma and things. And I was wondering, I've always wanted to ask you this. I'm so happy to have this opportunity to ask you, were you aware of the shamanic sort of perspective on healing and, soul retrieval, soul loss? Was that a part of your thinking in the beginning?
Not at all in the very beginning. So, I was, I didn't know from parts. I didn't know anything. So I really just learned it from my clients, but I don't know how many years into it, maybe 3 or 4 years into it, I attracted a student named Mitchie Rose who had in studying shamanism. And she started pointing out these parallels. And first I thought, oh my God, I've just stolen their wheel, whatever it is, rediscovered their wheel. Then I started saying, no, there are some differences. And I read Sandra Ingerman's work and, several of the other writers at the time. And yeah, it did seem like simply by having a client focus on a part, you were entering the same world they take people into. And they do it through drums and chanting and, other methods. But all seemed like the only thing you needed was just to focus on a part. And boom, you're in this world. And they would describe it in a fairly similar way in terms of what they encountered. Although, they would talk about soul retrieval as a piece of your soul that was, that's an exile. But they didn't have similar words for protectors that I'm aware of or other kinds of things. And when they did the soul retrieval, they would rely on what they called a spirit guide to do it rather than on self.
Right.
So one of the big distinctions I'll make is that one of the big goals of IFS is what I'll call the restoration of trust of the parts in the self's leadership that comes when the self is the one who goes into the scene and takes that little kid and brings him back and holds him and so on. So that's one big difference. And there are a number of others, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important difference in terms of the agency and the self wholeness that comes with doing the heavy lifting of that hurting child part.
Mm-hmm. Self-leadership.
Yeah.
I'm curious about in the early days, did you have any concern that you were sort of dancing in the multiple personality realm? I mean, I know it's called something different now, but were you concerned you might be colluding with the separation of parts? And then how do you frame that now in terms of parts work and the spectrum of DID, and how do you frame all of that now?
Yeah, so I was in those early days at a place called the Institute for Juvenile Research, which was part of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Illinois in Chicago, which was a very psychoanalytic department at the time. And I initially, when clients started talking this way, and I had a couple of clients that would talk about their parts as if they had a huge amount of autonomy and could take over any time. And when they did, it would be this totally different person who had all kinds of things to say. And so at first I did get scared that maybe these clients are sicker than I thought. And then I started listening inside myself and I found, oh my God, I've got them too. And some of mine are as extreme about food and other issues as theirs. And that calmed me down. And then I did try to present this to the Department of Psychiatry in grand rounds several times and got just attacked around that issue that you brought up, because this was a department that was very Kohutian, you know what that, like Heinz Kohut.
Mm-hmm.
Had this big fear of fragmenting people. And that was the big accusation. By having clients focus on these parts, you're further fragmenting them. And so I had, one of the leaders try to get me fired, and so a lot of scars from those days. And so yeah, I had to confront that too, and point out how people come in pretty fragmented. They know their parts, and they know their parts are pretty polarized and pretty out there. We're going to these parts and rounding them up and bringing them back home, which is integrative. It's not fragmenting. Now, in the process, as I said, I learned the hard way. You can further fragment people if you're not respectful of the ecology. And I suspect that that's part of what had happened with them, that they weren't. And so they did fragment people more. And so then they thought just mucking around with the idea of ego states will fragment people. So.
As we were preparing for this conversation, I watched a few videos of you on YouTube, and one of the things that jumped out at me as something that I didn't know about IFS was this concept of doing meditations. That was not a part of the model that I was familiar with. I'm wondering if you could elaborate for the audience of the part about, I guess what I'm specifically interested in is, in this world that we're in right now with COVID and social distancing and therapy happening remotely, are there ways that IFS needs to pivot, or ways that people can use IFS concepts to empower themselves?
Yeah, and we are fooling with that. So let me say a couple of things. First, one of the things I like best about IFS is that it does become a kind of life practice. And I have clients, for example, who will do an intense piece of work in my office, and they'll go home, and then the next session, first 20 minutes, they're just telling me everything they did on their own between sessions. And then we'll pick up where they dropped off and take it the next round. And so there are people who can do a huge amount on their own. There are some people who can only work with protectors. It's too scary to go to exiles. That's myself is one of those people. I need somebody there with me when I go to an exile. But there's a whole lot of work you can do with just with protectors that will actually change enormous things about your life. So we are wanting to bring it more to the general public. And so we're struggling with some of that, with how to do it in a safe way and make sure people have backup if they need it and so on. And yeah, the meditations are a part of that. And there are people that do the meditations on a daily basis like you would if you were just meditating. And in contrast to a lot of other forms of meditation, again, it's respectful, because there are so many meditations. I'm on a soapbox about this. This is I'm writing about this now, actually. So many spiritualities that have an attitude about the ego or the monkey mind or the, whatever it is, derogatory term they have for the parts of you that do want you to think of and remember things to do, or do have attachments to things in the world and material things and so on, and they really get a bad name in the spiritual field. So what I find is that once you see them as sacred inner beings, which is the way I see them, and you treat them with that kind of respect, they don't mind giving you 20 minutes to meditate. They actually can enjoy it too. But if you're dissing them and you're fighting with them, they're going to fight to come back. And then you've got to work your ass off to be able to have the 20 minutes to yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a practical matter.
Yes, totally.
Kindness is so much easier. Yeah.
And it's all parallel. The way you are in the inner world is the way you're going to be in the outer world. So if you're mean to your parts, then you're going to be that way to other people.
I'm curious about there's a lot of therapeutic modalities out there that might have you imagine protectors, for instance, to create an inner resource during a hard piece of work. And there's sort of a process of, let's imagine who might come in right now to help you. And with parts work in IFS, are you ever creating something from the imagination that maybe wasn't there already? Or is parts work really about identifying aspects of the psyche that are ever present?
It's much, much more the latter. And part of this is because we don't find the need for those kind of, I think they call it resourcing, because of self. So those systems don't know about self, don't know how to access it. But when you know about self and can access it, that's pretty much all you need. You don't need extra people coming in or anything like that. So, that might sound arrogant, but that's been my experience. And let me just say one other thing. one of the problems I have with resourcing, if you work with very severely traumatized clients, is they will have parts that will fight it. There are parts of those clients who don't want you to feel good about yourself, don't want you to have confidence, don't want you to heal yourself. And if you just start trying to resource a client, they're going to backlash. They're going to fight against it. So, so that's another reason why we work with those parts up front to get permission to help the client feel good or heal or whatever they do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think of, a lot of the different modalities do talk about presence as a part of the healing agent. And is self a mindfulness, a presence that's occurring? Is that what self is?
Yeah, that's a reasonable question. So for me, mindfulness is a good first step in the sense that as you separate from your thoughts and emotions, which are, from most of those perspectives are thought to be ephemeral, as you separate from them, you're accessing more self. Now, my position is, in contrast to most mindfulness therapies, it isn't compassionate to watch suffering beings parade by without trying to help them. And yet, most of those approaches basically do that. You become a passive witness who are watching your thoughts and emotions parade by because they don't think of them as suffering inner beings. So that would be the difference. The second step is to follow your compassion and actually engage with them and try to help them and hold them and comfort them and give them a lot of love and help them transform.
Yeah, that perspective really resonates with me in terms of the bystander role in trauma, and which feels kind of, in this conversation about mindfulness, feels connected in with a tendency I've noticed in myself as a meditator to sometimes dissociate rather than meditate. I'm curious about, is meditation part of the integration process with an IFS?
Yeah, although it needs to be integrated with IFS. So you got me on these rants that I'm on these days with spirituality, but there are too many people use meditation or other spiritual things as what John Wellwood called way back in the 80s, a spiritual bypass.
Yes.
And so it becomes just another firefighter activity or manager activity to keep you away from the exiles. And it might be that when you were meditating, an exile was starting to come up, and so the spiritual bypass meditating part took you out, dissociated you. And I've had that experience. I've had lots of patients who were meditators, and as we head toward their exiles, suddenly they say, I just feel peaceful. I feel really good. I feel happy and calm. And I said, get that part to step out. It doesn't have to take you there right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some of the signals you're looking for in parts work along this concept of, we could say, spiritual bypassing, where we can sort of sophisticatedly dissociate from the part or the experience? What are some of the signals you're looking for to see if somebody's actually working the part or they're actually sort of dissociating from the process?
Yeah. So, we have this question, like, Keith, if I was to have you focus on a part, my next question will automatically be, how do you feel toward it? And in answering that question, you're going to tell me how much of yourself is present. So, and it's not just the words, it's also the tone of voice and the expression on your face. So self has a kind of signature that includes those 8 C words and other qualities, and a kind of tone of voice and a kind of look. And so I'm watching for that all the time. And there are what we call self-like parts. Some of the, spiritual bypass parts of that, but there are other kinds who are managers, and they're just trying to keep you 1 degree removed from your body and your feelings because they're afraid that you can't handle it. But they can talk a good game. They can kind of seem like, a lot of therapists do therapy from that place. But we've come to get a pretty good nose for when those parts are doing it for you. And the other, like if I were to say, Keith, I'd like you to go into that scene and be with that little boy in the way he needed somebody, which is the first step in the retrieval. And you said, okay, they're there. Say, what do you mean they? You see yourself there? If you see yourself, that's not yourself. That's some part trying to do it for you. So ask them to step back and tell me when you are there such that you don't see yourself, you see the boy and your surroundings, but you're there. So the self is your seat of consciousness in that sense. You can't see yourself.
I'm curious along the line of this meditations concept for, getting this out more to the public. And if you're designing a type of meditation that gets a person connected to self and their parts, what types of things would you tell people to do for a meditation practice? I mean, there's so many, right, in terms of meditation practices, and there's somatic meditations, there's more visual meditations. I'm curious what would be useful for this type of work.
Yeah, well, I have used to be a CD, I guess now you download it, 8 meditations on our website, which so they all have different purposes. Some are designed to help you find parts. Some are designed to help you access self. And actually some of those we just gave to Insight Timers, so people can actually access that for free now, I think, some of it. And I forgot your original question, but...
Well, I guess you're speaking to most of it, and then just maybe some specific meditation practices you've designed here to get more in contact with self. Let's start there.
Yeah, so the basic one like that, we call the trail meditation, or path meditation. So I would say to you, Keith, put yourself at the base of a path and have all your parts be there with you. And then ask them to let you go out on the path and they stay there at the base and just wait for you to return. And you promise them you will return, and you organize things so the ones who are scared are taken care of by the ones who aren't. And then you head out on this path. Again, not such that you watch yourself, you're just there on the path. And people find that they'll catch parts as we go and ask them to go back to the base. But increasingly, they begin to experience more and more what we call pure self, or pure experience of self, where they'll feel a sense of well-being, a sense of everything's okay, a sense of all the 8 C's, lack of any kind of self-consciousness, and so on. And then when they get a real good hit of that, then we'll have them go back to the base and be with their parts from this place. And the parts always respond in a really good way to having you come back more differentiated. So that's just one example.
It reminds me some of the sort of concept of hypnotic induction. Do you ever frame that there's sort of a hypnotic state, not necessarily suggestibility, but there's a narrowing of the focus and creating a relaxation in the brain? And is there an element of hypnosis in this work?
People would say you've got somebody in a trance, but like you said, we don't use any suggestions, or it's not like classical hypnosis at all in many ways. For me, it's much more akin to the shamanic stuff we were talking about. Because for me, and this might sound weird also, but for me, this is a literal other world, a kind of alternative world that literally exists, that you're entering. It's not a creation. It's not an imagined place. And what you do in that world has big impact on what happens in this world.
So more of a shift into a different mode, or attending to the inner landscape. Is that how, rather than a hypnotic state?
Yes. And rather than provide directives or suggestions, we're just kind of along for the ride. We're following. There are times where I'll provide some guidance, but more and more, as self is more and more present, people just start telling me what they're doing. And many of my sessions, a good 70% of the session, I'm silent. My client is just telling me everything they're doing on their own inside. And then at the end of the therapy, they say some version of, you're a pretty good therapist, but I healed myself. And that's what we're shooting for. And it's true. I had, especially in the beginning, I had something to do with it, but afterwards, it's mainly my presence. And because I can access a lot of self as a therapist, my presence is powerful. It's like a powerful medicine, like MDMA or something, Protectors relax and they pulls out their self. And so that's a whole nother topic, is the presence of the therapist and how IFS works with that.
Well, it's I think probably partly as a scientist, I would say it's probably mediated by similar signaling in oxytocin, right? The powerful presence of a therapist, the effects of MDMA, both are really creating a field effect that where the oxytocin allows for more trust and bonding and receptivity and openness and the whole nine yards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, Dick, how can people learn more about IFS and anything that's up right now you want them to know about?
Yeah, our website is ifs-institute.com, and all our trainings and other events are on it, as well as a store where you can get that meditation CD I mentioned, and lots of books and other things. We have now converted all of our trainings online, and we have with some trepidation, and turns out it's going very well so far. So I'm really relieved about that. And it may, I think there's a lot of things that are going to change because of this crisis. And for me, that's one. I used to travel, I would say, between 65 and 70% of the time. I was away from home. And it turns out I like being at home. And I like being with my wife. So I'm committed to doing more of this kind of stuff rather than being on airplanes all the time.
That's great. Well, we always end with a question that you might find interesting, which is, if you had a billboard that every human being would see at one point in their lifetime, and it just has a message on there, you've got your paragraph, your one message that every person would get to see once, what would you tell them?
Oh, that's a good question. It would be a combination of self heals and there are no bad parts.
Yeah. Great. Well, Dick, thanks so much for being on the show. Again, just so appreciate the value you've brought to my own professional work and personally to dealing with a very fragmented psyche over time. And your work has been instrumental in my own personal journey of getting oriented and into a state of order. So again, thanks so much for everything you've done.
I'm honored to hear that, Keith, and I'm honored by both your and Will's interest in this work. And this has been a delightful conversation for me, so happy to do it again anytime.